Hi everyone, it's Beck from Britsent. Today I'm going to be talking about second conditionals. Second conditionals can seem quite difficult, but actually native speakers use them all the time, so they're very useful to know, especially if you want to sound like a native speaker. Let's look at the form or structure of a second conditional first of all. Conditionals have two parts to the sentence. There's the condition and the result. You can structure them so that the condition comes first and then the result comes afterwards, or the other way round, so the result comes first and the condition comes afterwards. If the condition comes first, the two parts of the sentence are divided by a comma. If the result comes first, there is no comma. Let's look at some examples. If I saw him, I wouldn't say hello. I wouldn't say hello if I saw him. In the condition or if part of the sentence, we generally use simple past, and in the result part, we generally will use a modal verb such as would, could, might, may, etc. Now let's look at situations where we might use a second conditional. The first is talking about an unlikely situation. For example, if I won the lottery, I would travel the world. The chance of me winning the lottery is really quite small, but we're saying what I would do if I did win the lottery. We can also use second conditionals to predict what would happen if a certain situation arises. If he had the chance to study abroad, he would take it. If people didn't have to work, they might get bored very quickly. I wouldn't say hello to him if I saw him. We can also use second conditionals to talk about unlikely or hypothetical events. For example, could you stay in your apartment if you lost your job? Would you feel better if you were happier at work? Wouldn't you take more exercise if you put on weight? So remember, we can use second conditionals with unlikely, impossible, or hypothetical events. There are other uses of the second conditional, and one of these is to offer advice. For example, if I were you, I would go to a doctor. If I were you, I'd book a holiday. You might notice that we use were instead of was. We say if I were you, not if I was you. This is an unusual case, and it's the English subjunctive, which is not used very often. You will hear a lot of native speakers say, if I was you, or if I was the boss. Technically, this is incorrect. However, many native speakers actually do make that mistake. But you should try to say, if I were you. We can also use second conditional to suggest improvements. For example, if you got up earlier, you wouldn't be so stressed in the morning. If you filed your emails properly, you would be able to find the information that you needed. A third way we can use second conditional is with tag questions. Remember, there's a positive-negative balance in a tag question. So if the statement is positive, the tag will be negative, and if the statement is negative, the tag will be positive. For example, you would tell me if you were unhappy, wouldn't you? You wouldn't buy a car if you got a raise, would you? In these two situations, we are trying to check information to see if it's true, or we are seeking reassurance from the other person. It can happen that we don't need to use both halves of the conditional. We can only use the would clause. Would clauses are extremely common in English, both in writing and in speaking. For example, I wouldn't park there. I'd say something. The condition, if I were you, is implied and we don't need to state it. We're just giving our opinion and some advice. As I mentioned earlier, The most common tense to use in second conditional is simple past in the if clause. However, we can use other tenses too. These tend to be much less common than the ones that we have already looked at. For example, if you could lend me some money, I would be very grateful. So we have if with could and would in the result clause. Because we're making a polite request, we use could rather than if I can or if you can. Okay? The second verb is would, so it follows the same pattern as a standard second conditional. Let's look at another example. Oh, if he would only get a job, he wouldn't be so unhappy. Here we're expressing frustration that someone doesn't have a job, and we wish that he would get a job. Therefore, we use would only in the if part of the sentence. However, as I said, these structures are less common, so it might be best to stick to the more common ones that we've already covered. All right, so now you know how to form second conditionals and when to use them. That's all from me. See you again. Bye.